Hello, and welcome to the Skip Podcast. I'm your host, Nikhyl Singhal. I'm here to kind of continue a series that I started a few episodes ago, really focused on what's career advice in 2023 look like. You know, we know that there's been so many changes in the market in just the past few months and few quarters that the way we think about growth companies and ex-growth companies, the way we think about big tech and late stage companies, the career advice associated with those two phases are really different. And I think the third phase is how do people approach startups? So as we examine career opportunities and starting up, I also want to take a step back and devote this episode to a conversation around how the head of product role has changed. And what I mean by head of product, I mean the head of product management role. That role has changed a lot, as much as most career opportunities and optimizations have changed over the past few years. And so by looking at the head of product role, we can not only examine, does it make sense to work in X growth? Does it make sense to work as a number two? Does it make sense to return to big tech, or does it make sense to start a company? Why head of product? Well, head of product is an area that I spend a lot of time talking with. You know, I have this great Skip community where we work with almost 30 head of products, trying to understand what are the challenges in the workplace, how do we improve our effectiveness at these companies, and how is the market shifting, and how is the role shifting? And I think that when you start seeing the patterns that apply, they don't only apply to the product management function, but they also apply to what it's like to be an executive in these different roles. And so this podcast has always had a focus on top performers, career, and product management in some ways. And so what I'd love for us to discuss is how this head of product role is changing. Does it make sense to start up? And then apply it to maybe the functions that you represent if you're not in product management. And if you're not an executive today, you still have an opportunity to learn quite a bit about what maybe your boss or your boss's boss is considering, or what maybe your future self should be thinking about as the market kind of unfolds. So I look forward to kind of bringing this content to you. We're going to talk startups, we're going to talk head of product, and actually let's talk about the product management role first. Product management's evolved quite a bit in the last 10 years. You know, about 10 years ago, this concept of blitzscaling or hypergrowth companies emerged. You know, that was largely because these distribution platforms from Amazon and Google and Facebook really became table stakes. And between those platforms and the growth of mobile, you know, startups were able to go from product market fit to, you know, exceptional growth almost overnight. What took LinkedIn 10 years to grow, Uber was now able to do in 18 months. And that created a very, very different atmosphere and opportunity for companies, because they immediately started to see, you know, we were able to go from a local product to a global product and become a market leader on an exponential basis. We need to expand our product line, scale our product, and we need experts who can do that. And the product management function became kind of the primary function to help with scale and expansion. You know, in some ways, you've got people that can build stuff, people that can sell stuff, and then the product managers in between who kind of are the glue that increasingly, as a company is in this hypergrowth stage, the glue is even more important than ever before, right? So the CPO, the Chief Product Officer, became the critical hire. And so many boards, many leadership teams said, well, unless we have a product executive who has been there, done that, it's going to be really, really challenging. And you needed someone who can come in and be an expert in just the core product management function, the idea of prioritization, the idea of collaboration, the idea of goal setting, execution. But that person needed to be very, very closely tied to the CEO and the executive team. Because, you know, in the past, prior to the product management function being installed, most likely the founders and the CEO were the ones owning product market fit, and frankly did quite a good job because the company is in growth mode now. And so there's a lot of soft skills needed to insert oneself and say, look, I'm an expert but I have to recognize that the existing team has done a tremendous job and not just install my version, but a new version that is a blend between what the next answer is and what the last answer was. So they need to be a team builder, an org builder. They needed to be an amazing collaborator. And this became a very difficult role. Again, this is why I started the Skip CPO community, because the tenures were about 2 years in these cases, which is a shocking statement. CPOs could hire, 2 years later, they would end up being asked to leave, or they would end up moving on their own. And largely because these phases companies were moving through these growth phases so quickly that the needs of the organization when the person was hired radically changed in just a 2-year period. Sometimes the companies didn't grow particularly well, and the CPO looked at it and said, look, you're really still trying to get your product to find market fit, and I was brought in for expansion, and so this isn't really the right fit. Or the CEO started to feel like, well, I think now that the product management function's installed, we need more product strategy, and that's kind of my job. And so this process of finding the right fit for the product manager head, finding the lane that makes most sense, and then ensuring they have a path forward was pretty tricky. And so often founders and CPOs and CEOs and management teams were a little bit at odds. And it isn't necessarily a bug that it's a 2-year kind of role. But a lot of what we talk about in our community is how to make that 2 years, 3 years. How do we ensure that we enter in correctly, partner effectively with the team, install product management, build credibility, build trust, and move forward? Well, as I've talked to the CPOs in the group and many others that are outside the group, in the past 12 months, there's been a sudden shift, as we've talked about on this podcast a number of times, between, hypergrowth to sustainability. And in the process, as I spoke about a few episodes ago, the CPOs were layered in many cases, or they were asked to leave, or they exited themselves, because not only is the company in a different phase, but oftentimes the pretense of hiring the CPO was, we need someone to expand and grow. And now they look at it and say, we need someone that can come in and help build sustainability, or perhaps they don't need the same type of product management function. And so many of these CPOs ended up being released from the company, which now has increased the number of open positions in the marketplace for head of product. So if any of you are product managers listening to this and you're senior, you're probably seeing so many more open roles than ever before, which is kind of a weird anomaly in the market, that there's so many positions when the market is struggling in many ways. Yet candidates are very cautious to close these roles. So these roles are staying open because there's a lot of concern that the companies that we're growing, as we've spoken about, may not be as sustainable. And, nobody wants to join a sinking ship, especially as the number one product head. So searches are taking longer. Positions are more numerous than ever before. Candidates are being asked to leave. And kind of in this weird, ironic twist, a lot of the candidates that do get hired are the same people that were ejected because they weren't told they were great at sustainability. Yet, in many ways, it wasn't the skills of the product leader that led them to exit. It was just the expectations of the hire. So to be a little bit more clear, I hire Sally because I think the company needs to expand and grow. Sally comes in and does a reasonable job, but then all of a sudden the company takes a turn and I need someone who I think is proven in sustainability and maybe efficiency. So Sally and I have a tough conversation, and Sally ends up leaving, and I end up hiring someone who's a little bit maybe more hands-on, perhaps ask one of my founders who came in early with me, who helped find product market fit. I say, hey, why don't you come in and kind of continue to run this with me like we did in the old days. Sally, meanwhile, is back in the marketplace. Sally goes talks to company two. Company two is like, look, we're looking for someone who can do more efficient, sustainable growth. And, Sally interviews for the role and they think, well, Sally, you're great. Sounds like you've had a lot of experience. We'd love to have you come on board. Sally takes the job. Well, it's so crazy because Sally's the same person and could have easily switched that tactic to be a lot more efficient and sustainable, but companies and CEOs are relatively panicked right now. And so as a result, you have this sort of weird kind of growth of open positions and exits happening all at the same time. And big tech execs are often, being courted for these new roles because they've seen the sort of movie before, and they're really unhappy in many cases because their comps are far lower than they may have in the past. And so you've got this like more candidates interested looking for roles, more positions open, and it's just a very confusing time. So I am going to spend a little bit of time trying to sort of help all of you who are head of products kind of piece together, hey, if you're looking for a top role in a company, here's my guidance as to what you should and shouldn't look for, or what you should avoid, and maybe what you should lean into. If you look at the head of product role, let's examine it by stage of company, because though there are so many more roles open, I actually think there aren't that many good ones. So I've been on record of saying that growth companies that aren't growing anymore, the so-called ex-growth companies, are the weakest and most undesirable to join, particularly as a head of product. And the rationale is fairly straightforward. That oftentimes those positions were vacated by an ex-CPO who was asked to leave or perhaps was layered. There's a lot more of those roles available now, and there's a lot of candidates being interviewed for those roles. But CEOs and boards have found themselves trying to regain or find product market fit for the first time. And I've used this analogy of now you're in an ocean liner navigating the sort of class 4 rapids. Founders that are CEOs more often than not are just unskilled. But they're unskilled and they have this expectation that they have a false sense of success. They have this idea that we were so successful and now we're not necessarily successful. Well, they were successful when money was free and 0% interest. And now you could argue, have never been successful, but they have this understanding that they were very, very successful. And so they're trying to regain this past sense of glory, when in reality, that glory may have been false to begin with. So the role that you have in this head of product role is to be this leader of layoffs, this driving this new strategy, resetting expectations around the business with sort of short timelines, and then this sort of panic almost of like, we need to go left really fast, we need to go right really fast, and at the velocity that a large company, a large ocean liner, I would say, would take. The compensation also is often very, very off because the equity itself is based on valuations that may never be reached again. So I believe, though, that there's more of these head of product roles open than ever before. There's a reason for it. And I would just say, look, life is short. Why would you want to go through this pain? Avoid it if you can. Now, the flip side, of course, is that not all growth companies are unhealthy. There are a set of companies that are starting to grow and maybe rapidly grow. They're probably 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 50 compared to what it was in the past. But those companies are exceptional opportunities. And if you find yourself in a position where the company has a great upside, hasn't had to go through a step back, has a really good set of expectations, those companies are fantastic. And the challenge in those companies are actually the opposite. They have the ability to attract the highest quality candidates. These elite candidates, they can attract someone who's used to doing much more senior work and get them to do a much smaller role than maybe they were previously qualified for. And as a result, what often happens is that even though these companies are going well, they actually aren't opening a number one role. What they're actually doing is they're saying to the boards and the founders themselves are saying, why don't you continue to hold on to running product? So what often happens is you end up with VP roles where you own a piece of the product, but the CEO or perhaps the prior CTO or whoever was running the product market fit journey maintains that for a longer period of time than in the past. which, in some ways makes sense because the company is not in expansion and scale mode. And so maybe you get asked to join and just work on the scale of the core product or just work as a general manager for some new product area. But what's happened in these growth companies that are actually healthy is you tend to have a much smaller, much more narrow role. And, in some ways, if you like the culture, you like the way the product market fit journey is going and the executive who's in charge, you can make a case that maybe that's a good gig. Come in with smaller role, learn the language, learn the product line, get to know the culture, and then ultimately maybe you might be able to step into that larger role, or perhaps even without that, the compensation, the learning, the fact that you can get great talent around you because there's not that many of these companies is still very career additive. So I like, kind of coming in and joining a healthy growth company, even if it's not the number one role, simply because these are some of the companies that will do the best in this market. And I would rather avoid the number one roles at these unhealthy companies where you almost certainly are going to be, jostled over the side as the company ends up navigating these choppy waters. So I've spoken about this ex-growth company and this really healthy growth company, and I've suggested that, hey, even if you can't get the number one, this number two at a healthy growth company is important. I think I even expand this just a tiny bit. And I would say that, look, there's also companies that are out there that are a little bit more stable, a little bit later stage. They're not necessarily growing or, the next big thing, but they weren't as impacted by the impact of the market and the shift. They were one of the leaders and they remain being one of the leaders. They may have gone through some layoffs, but they're strong, solid companies. And perhaps the person that runs that, team, the product management team in this example, is solid. Those number two roles that of companies that will continue to be an ongoing concern are very interesting to me right now. And I think that they, again, compare much more favorably than the number one. So even if the company is not the next big thing, a lot of my head of products are coming to me and saying, if my choice is to be the number one and go through that journey again, or to be in a number two role, take on a more narrow, like say a VP of product position, and do it for a company for a few years where I can learn from someone who has done the product management role before. And even if the company doesn't grow at an exponential rate, I can learn a core skill. This reminds me a little bit of this discussion I had last episode around sometimes managers are better off kind of going hands-on. I think the same thing could be said. It's, hey, you build different skills if you're going to be owning a lane than if you're owning the entire team. You don't have a seat on the management team, but you perhaps learn how to build a really solid, high quality team. You deliver a product maybe from, version 2 to version 3. Maybe you're owning a P&L. Maybe you're really hands-on with the detail. But in these examples, the comp ideally is predictable. Maybe the equity is not going to take off like this sort of high growth company, but maybe your equity isn't as substantive in your package because you're not the number one. And so you end up with a slightly smaller package with a higher degree of predictability. And what you're effectively doing in these examples of number two is you're thinking about your skip job. You're saying, hey, I am going to not take the risk of a number one role that doesn't really have a company behind it. I'm going to take this number two, and I'm going to eventually build the skill to be attractive to the next number one when maybe the market improves and there's more higher quality companies, right? So two variants on this number two example. One is a number two where maybe the founders are running the product team for a longer period of time, where you're sort of, hey, maybe I'm going to take this role, shows some promise, the company goes into hypergrowth, and I might be the first person that's tapped. And then the second case is that there's number two roles where the leader is an installed leader and the company may not be a hypergrowth, but it's a very solid company. In both cases, I think are really career additive and worth looking at. Okay, so the other roles that my head of products tend to spend a lot of time examining these days is big tech roles. And I generally think that there's a lot of wisdom in general with career. of oscillating between growth or sort of startup-y growth companies that are going through this sort of install the function and get to the next level, expand at all costs. This hypergrowth thing is really interesting. And then you move to big tech. And then you oscillate back from big tech back to sort of this startup-y growth and going back and forth. And the reason is each time maybe you're looking at it from a higher altitude, meaning you're director, maybe you're senior director, maybe you're VP. So you end up seeing things grow at a higher rate. Because you're still in product management, you end up seeing the movie from lots of different places. And that always makes you a better career professional. So when a lot of head of products are saying, look, coming out of this number one role, I don't want to necessarily repeat that, they look at big tech. And I think it's a great trajectory for the reasons I've mentioned recently, because it has strong compensation. It's a very big brand builder. And it's a great place to see consistency and wait out the storm, if you will. The biggest challenge with big tech is that there's just not that many roles right now because they're all going through major layoffs, product consolidation. There's not as many prime positions. A lot of those prime positions are going to folks that are already in the building. But I do think it's worth considering. Those companies will continue to hire. They're large employers, so there are positions. And the main piece of advice is not to look at it as a small 1 or 2 year investment. If you're kind of coming in and saying, I need a place to sort of maybe take the edge, I'm coming off of a really traumatic head of product role, I need a couple of years where I don't have to necessarily look over my shoulder, I don't think that's big tech. Because I think that more and more it takes a couple of years for you to really hit your stride, the larger the company there is. I almost think there's almost like a corollary between the number of people in the company and the long length of time it takes to sort of find flow if you're a senior leader. And so if you're going to come in and you're going to take 1 to 2 years to really get to be yourself, and then afterwards you're like, well, I'm out, that's kind of a wasted couple of years. You're better off doing one of these number 2 roles in a slightly more growthy environment where you really could establish some impact because the lane is a much tighter lane and the company itself is not as complex to understand. But if you are looking at a 3 to 5 year tenure, I think that this is a great place to go. And in which case, spending 3 to 5, 6 months finding the right role, building relationships, navigating the internals to find the starting position makes perfect sense. The second thing I always caution people, as I spoke about prior, is you really have to make sure that you're comfortable in solving that inside the building problem. That the outside the building problem, like, hey, my interest is finding a product, coming up with the concept, and then putting it out the door. That's just not really the challenge that large technology companies have because they have so much distribution. It's really inside the building. What's the right thing for the end user that when we deliver it is incremental. It's new to the user as opposed to just moving people from one product to another product or one feature to another feature. Right? It's a much different challenge. So the inside the building problems, the patience it takes to deliver, again, that speaks to tenure and it speaks to understanding relationships and understanding the business, which is why that 3 to 5 year minimum makes sense. But some head of products, and actually a large number, probably the majority of head of product, come out of these roles and they don't come in and they say, look, I just can't imagine myself doing it again, especially if the tenure was short, like less than 2 years, maybe 1 year. They'll say, I feel like I got a little bit of my footing. I really enjoy the role. I thought that being a head of product, sitting on the management team, kind of managing the balance between scale and innovation was really kind of my happy place. And I've never been more excited and more challenged in my professional career. So the idea of going number 2 or big tech just doesn't feel right to me. And so, but I buy your advice that this X growth stage is just rife with too many errors. And in fact, it's a lot like my last role. So I'm not necessarily forcing myself back into the head of product role. What do I do? And what I end up suggesting is, look, there are a lot of head of product roles that are out there that aren't growth roles, but they're post product market fit. And in the past, I would have said that these roles are so small that it's almost like a quote unquote step backwards for a lot of these more senior leaders. But today, maybe that's the most attractive role for number ones that are out there. So let me be a bit more precise here. So, imagine a company which, was a startup, got some financing, found a rhythm with product market fit, and is now sort of sitting down and saying, well, we've got a couple of product managers in the team, and we need sort of our first sort of director of product. We need someone who can kind of come in and put in product management, but the expectation, if asked how big the product management team will be in 6 to 12 months, they're like, well, we're 2 or 3 now, maybe we'll get to 4 or 5. It's the scaling of the product management team is not what we're worried about. We're just worried about making sure that the product that we have continues to scale. And we're not looking for a product strategist. We think we know what we need to build. And we're not looking for someone who has experience in not only just team building and org, but expansion. We're really looking for someone who knows how to run the nuts and bolts of product management and work as a partner to the CEO. Now, the compensation in these companies are heavily based on equity, which probably the company is valued in the double to triple digits, 25, 50, 100, 200, $300 million company. They're not billions of dollars. And so your offer will look like a percentage of the company. It won't look like a number of RSUs, because the company is really early. And so, and they don't have base and bonus that's going to be competitive to perhaps the roles that, you were able to get in the past. So it's a lower compensation. It's a heavy risk on equity, and it's a much smaller team. So in many ways in the past, we said, well, if you were qualified to get one of these later stage roles, why would you not just skip ahead in the movie? Why would you go back through this? Well, the problem is the companies that are further ahead are often in decline. And so I actually like this stage of company for many of you. I think that being an early stage head of product, if you enjoy building product, building, the actual end user offering, working more closely on the details with the customer, with the sales teams, with the other engineers and data scientists and designers, this is actually a great role. But the risk you take is this company may not actually work itself out, but many of them might be the next thing, and they may become the sort of growth phase. And by being in early and perhaps having some experience that's a little ahead, meaning a lot of the folks that are listening to this are actually more experienced professionals than anyone in these companies. And so they're in some ways taking a step back. They're overqualified. But what it does is it increases your chance that you will not get layered and you'll have a higher tenure. You won't have a 2-year, but you'll have a 3 or 4-year tenure. And so if you can afford the risk to the compensation and you enjoy being hands-on, this is the number one role to go after, not the X growth, hoping to turn things around and return to the previous days of what I would call false glory. Okay, then now to summarize, we've talked about, look, if you're looking for a number one role, focus on the earlier, healthier companies. Don't focus on the X growth companies. If you're looking for a leadership role in these sort of growth phased companies, number twos are really interesting if you can improve the quality of the company. I'd much rather see people in a number 2 role at a higher quality company than a number 1 role at a lower quality company. And in often cases, the compensation actually works itself out because it's a little bit more predictable. Big tech is a great choice for a lot of folks that are able to get these number 1, number 2 roles, but they're harder to find and require a broader tenure. Now, the last phase, and perhaps I think a lot of you, not just head of products out there, are thinking through, well, isn't this the time to start up? And in some ways, startups are really risky. People all the time will tell me, hey, I'm thinking about starting a company and I've always wanted to do it, but it's just really risky. And it seems like this is a really tough time. And, then there's the counterpoint, which is, look, some of the best companies are born right now when expectations are a bit more accurate. You end up building more gritty startups, you have more access to talent, et cetera. I think that my sense is this is actually a pretty good time to start a company for those of you that are really passionate about that journey. And, I historically don't suggest that you should try to time the market because either you irrationally want to start up or you don't. It's not as much of an intellectual as an emotional decision. But I definitely don't think this is a bad time. And so if climate was one of the deterrents, let's talk a little bit about what the climate's like. And maybe I'll look at it from a set of objections that I typically hear when I coach people through this. So a lot of people are saying that, hey, the opportunity cost of starting up is the reason why I don't join a startup or I don't found a company, meaning that I've gotten to a place in my career where I can get an executive role. And so I can get paid very well. I can have a lot of impact. I don't need to start up in that example. And, when you're earlier in your career, if you're a cog in the wheel versus starting a company, startups actually compare quite favorably. If you're late in your career, startups don't compare as well because you can do really big things without as much quote unquote risk and having to come up with the team and the idea and the financing. I think that the challenge right now is that those top roles are rife with risk, as we've talked about here. It's hard to find in big tech. It's hard to find in a growth company. You end up taking risk in these earlier stage. So given all of these phases of company, there's no real clean lane. This might be the time to look at, well, my opportunity cost isn't as high as it has historically because the market's pretty messy, because so many of them have shifted expectations. If you start a company now, the expectations are consistent with the market. So that'll kind of fuel you where maybe that'll be an advantage compared to other companies that are reeling because they were hiring for one kind of growth and now they have a different kind of growth. The second objection that I hear concern around is really that I don't have a compelling idea. And I think that that's a very fair point. The concept of the idea, being able to pursue something for a long period of time is important. I think that the interesting thing is that, that in of itself means that either you sit and you wait until a eureka moment hits. And I think that almost never happens. And so in some ways, when people say they don't have a compelling idea, I sometimes decode that as I'm not emotionally excited about the journey of being on my own and doing something from scratch. And if that's the case, you should not be doing a startup. But if you really genuinely are like, I really, really want to start up, I just have a hard time kind of getting over that first base issue. There are so many infrastructure systems set up to sort of help you if you are qualified and excited to do this startup. You can work with incubators, you can network with VCs. Friends are oftentimes asking the same questions. In some ways, by raising your hand and telling people, look, this is the thing I'm wanting to do and I want to do, you find yourself almost like speaking it into the world. And so you'll generate luck, but you have to network your way to find folks that have ideas but don't have teams, right? And that's the third objection. People say, I've got a concept and I really want to do it, but I don't have a partner. And I think that, again, more people are looking around for their next thing than ever before because every phase of company has gone through this retrenchment. So even in big tech, a lot of folks are like, well, I've been here for a really long time, and now is the right time to maybe take a look elsewhere, or maybe my comp, when I joined 2 years ago is dramatically lower, so I need to make a move no matter what. So there's a lot of people in the market looking around like yourself. And so my sense is that if you raise your hand and say, look, I don't have the partner, I have an idea, I don't have an idea, but I have a partner, you can kind of find your ways by navigating through this, but you have to be present to win. So my sense is that, through these systems that may exist, through conversation and through speaking it into the world, you might be able to connect it in the past, but it won't happen by just sitting there. So you have to sort of say, well, the first test to being a good startup person is to break through these barriers. Maybe idea and partner are two good ones. Now, a lot of folks are very open with me and they say, look, the idea of joining a startup is just hard on my lifestyle because I don't know if I can work that hard. And almost all of the folks that say that haven't actually done a startup. And what's interesting to me, and I've gotten some advice early in my career, and certainly I've done, been in 4 startups myself. In comparison, to leadership roles, which many of you are considering here, leadership roles that we've spoken about at number 1, number 2, at late stage, big tech, or perhaps growth. The fact is that I actually think that you work less hard in startups. Now, this sounds very controversial, and maybe people will think, well, maybe that's because you don't understand how like modern startups work. My general sense is if you look at how people spend time in big structured companies where you have hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of employees, there's just a lot of meetings. And the more of a leader you are, the more your job is to organize things. And so my meetings are oftentimes with dozens of people. There's lots of activity. There's lots of coordination. You've got offices that exist in different time zones. Perhaps you've got multiple teams that exist in your own group. And you spend a lot of time traveling. You spend a lot of time in meetings. You spend a lot of time coordinating. And those add up to hours and hours and hours. You also have your boss and your boss's boss and your boss's boss's boss, and they all need updates. So there's weekly reviews, monthly reviews, quarterly reviews, annual planning, half planning. All of that takes a ton of time. And I think a bunch of you that are listening to this are like, yeah, that's my job, basically. And none of that really exists in startups. So think about what that might mean if I took all of those things away. You don't have a boss's boss. You don't have a status update. Maybe you'll have a monthly or quarterly board meeting. But in many ways, those are conversations around top of mind and strategy. And, there's not that many employees to meet with. If you met with all the employees every single day, which would be kind of crazy, you'd still be able to get through half the day and have, half the day open. I think that, what you realize is that companies that are large have so much structure that you almost have to put in more hours. Now, what ends up happening, though, is the stress on a personal level is much higher. Because honestly, if you're in a bigger structured company and you don't show up for a week, the company's going to be fine. Your decisions aren't going to necessarily make or break the organization in many cases. Because the company is just further along. It's less brittle. It's more resilient. But I think that in a case where you are in an early stage, you have this personal stress that, boy, if I don't breathe life into this thing, it may not exist. And so for me, I sort of feel like, the stress is not you don't want to work that hard. The stress is more around personal failure. So my perspective is the framing that I tend to sort of suggest here is, look, if you don't have a compelling idea and you don't have a partner, that implies that you may not be interested in the journey of going and hacking your way through solving that. And if you don't want to work that hard, you probably don't have an hours issue. You probably get a lot less hours and a bit more freedom in your calendar because you control it. But you may not want the personal stress of owning the failure of the organization. And some people will say, well, the risk is just the economics. It's like, hey, I don't want to build something and have it fail. And my concern is that I could go to another job and I'll have a much higher chance of having comp. And my perspective is that's somewhat true because if you start something and it fails to get product market fit, you may shut it down. But a lot of you that are here, if you can go in and hire a high quality team, you will find a way to have some reasonable exit because companies will be interested in bringing a team that is high quality, working well together and solving an important problem into their fray, even if they haven't got distribution. I think that the key in this example is to hire well, which by the way is easier now because there's a lot of folks that are in market who want a better job. And to essentially make sure that you're working on something that's meaningful to perhaps a next stage of company, a later stage company. But I think that this compensation, in this case where you end up getting acqui-hired, that compensation is probably comparable to the compensation you would get if you were to join as a number 2 or join in these smaller earlier examples. So what I'm essentially saying is, look, if you're worried about the success of the company, there's a chance it'll fail, in which case, yeah, you'll learn a lot, but you'll get the shutdown, and that's some of it. But a lot of you will probably have a much higher chance of sort of getting on first base and getting the company sold to someplace and getting a comp package that looks a lot more like what you're looking at now in a number 2 role. And of course, there's a chance that you'll have some breakaway success and you'll have more fun probably doing it than ever before. So the real disadvantage is that, you just have to have the emotional resilience of solving some of these idea partner, and you have to be willing to do the challenging kind of grueling notion that it's up to you. And, you perhaps are delaying a lot of compensation gratification. So those are my kind of notes on startups, not just for product managers, for many executives that are considering founding. I think that if I was to sort of stack rank things, I think that, if you are emotionally excited about starting up, this might be one of the best times. Otherwise, I think if you can find a great role as a number 1 in a terrific growth company that's starting to take off, boy, that is awesome. But it's that or big tech roles are fewer and far between. And so if you can't find the top role or a big tech role and you can't find a startup because it really doesn't speak to you, go take some risk on an earlier stage company that's just starting to go and that's maybe looking for more of a hands-on leader. Go join that company because those companies could use you. You will breathe life. You'll be slightly overqualified for the role. If you had to go back, you could also look at a number 2 role of a healthier company. And those opportunities, I think, will also pay off. Well, the calculation in that case might be that it'll pay off maybe less directly, but it'll set you up for the next, right? But in all cases, I would say that this advice is almost the opposite of what I've given in the past, which is why I put this series together, because in the past, growth companies were just sort of the most interesting to join because they were growing in both directions at the same time. And big tech was perhaps a little bit less interesting because of the inside the building problems and how attractive these growth stage companies had become. And these early stage companies were less interesting because they were not as exciting because the growth companies would be able to pull you. So it's almost like this growth company was almost like the sucking sound for everyone that was pulling forward. Now when it's become far, 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 far narrower and actually rife with a lot of, companies that are in trauma, all of the other phases have suddenly become a lot more interesting. So that's why I put this together. Love to get your feedback. Please leave a review or a comment on the podcast. And I look forward to speaking to you more about career in an upcoming episode. Thanks, everyone.